Garrett Graff is a journalist and the author of two books, not one, but two books about Robert Mueller. In 2010, he published The Threat Matrix Inside Robert Mueller's FBI and the War on Global Terror. And now, in 2019, he's written Mueller's War, a closer look at how Mueller's military service as a lieutenant in the Vietnam War has impacted his 50-year career. Garrett is currently serving as the director of the Aspen Institute Cybersecurity and Technology Program, but also served as the editor of both the Washingtonian and Politico. It's nice to see you again, Garrett.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
Last year, you told me about Mueller's reputation of being a straight shooter. He's straight as an arrow, you said, and the obvious choice for special counsel on the Russia investigation. Now, you've known Mueller since, I think it's 2008, correct? And you've followed him closely. So how do you get inside the mind of Robert Mueller?
Everything that we have seen Robert Mueller do as special counsel is entirely consistent with everything that we know about how Robert Mueller has lived his life. This is someone who has spent the better part of 50 years in public service. This is someone who's a very seasoned, traditional conservative prosecutor. And really, that's what we have seen him do as special counsel. We saw a very conservative approach throughout the investigation. He only charged the blackest and whitest of crimes, which you see in the fact that he got convictions across the board. He brought guilty pleas from almost everyone else that he charged. This is someone who doesn't spend a lot of time playing in the gray. And that's also presumably what we're going to see in this final report whenever it actually does get released. He was narrowly focused on the question of Russian collusion and obstruction of justice, and particularly the way that those two intersected. And investigations that didn't pertain to those core questions, he spun out to other offices. That's why you had the Southern District of New York prosecuting some of the cases that grew out of Michael Cohen. That's why you had the Eastern District of Virginia, the federal prosecutors prosecuting some of the cases that spun out of Michael Flynn's lobbying work that related to Turkey, not Russia.
In your view, knowing Mueller, do you think there's anything strategic going on here, or was strategic in terms of how Mueller anticipated how the report might be released and who might see it?
We saw Bill Barr saying that he was working through, and the Justice Department was working through 4 different sets of exemptions. Now, none of those reactions or potential redactions are surprising. And you have to assume that Bob Mueller and his team wrote every word of this report anticipating the possibility of someone objecting under those categories. I mean, for one thing, that 6E grand jury testimony category, that's protected by law. It would be a felony to release it without the court's permission otherwise. So this is not like Bob Mueller sat down, wrote this whole report, handed it in to Bill Barr, who was sitting there flipping through it and was like, "Oh, Bob, you used all of this grand jury testimony." And Bob's like, "Oh man, I can't believe I didn't think of that. I guess no one's ever going to see this report now." I mean, that just, it is literally laughable that Bob Mueller didn't anticipate these potential objections. And so, well, I certainly understand that Barr probably wants to take his own time to go through what we now believe is a report somewhere between 300 and 400 pages total. Mueller is probably far ahead of Barr in thinking through those questions.
Are you surprised with that and that which we know about publicly, the Trump Tower meeting, for example, that the 4-page summary of William Barr was so lacking in detail?
Barr says that Mueller says that he didn't find a provable conspiracy. That leaves an incredible breadth of possibility still open. On the one hand, it could be literally nothing. All of this could be a weird series of coincidences and misunderstandings where all of the Trump people are 100% innocent. It could also mean that Mueller was working with a very high bar and specific definition of what conspiracy could look like, and that there could have been lots of evidence, but nothing that coalesced into what would be a charge, a federal criminal charge that Mueller felt he could prove using the rules of evidence beyond a reasonable doubt before a reasonable jury with 85% certainty, which is the bar that prosecutors have to meet in order to bring a charge. So Mueller could be sitting there saying, there's clear and consistent evidence of a conspiracy, which would be the civil standard for a finding, but not beyond a reasonable doubt evidence that would be a criminal standard.
That is so interesting, and it raises a question about the independence of the independent counsel. Obviously, you have written about Mueller. You see him as you said, a straight shooter, straight arrow. But he also was working under the duress, if you will, of an overtly, in many cases, politicized Justice Department. The Sessions wing, and some would even argue the Barr wing, given how Barr came to the Justice Department. How independent was the independent counsel in the context of these political pressures?
Yeah, so Mueller was much less independent as a special counsel than Ken Starr was as an independent counsel. Both sides looked at the Ken Starr investigation in Whitewater and said, that was a fiasco and nothing we want to repeat again. Let's change the rules. And so they wrote, rather than an independent counsel, this special counsel regulation, which is what Mueller was acting under from his authority during this period. And one of the things that, that does mean is that Mueller did have to report to Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, because Jeff Sessions had recused himself. One of the things that Barr did say in closing out the Mueller investigation was he was obligated under these special counsel regulations to report to Congress whether Mueller had asked at any point to do something and was told no. Barr said in his letter, in effect, that never happened, that there were no substantial differences of opinion, which is not to say that there weren't debates along the way, wasn't discussion along the way, but there was nowhere where Mueller wasn't able to do something that Mueller thought was absolutely necessary for his case. In your book, you create a striking contrast between Robert Mueller, the war hero, and Donald Trump, who didn't serve in the war allegedly because of bone spurs. How does Mueller reconcile conducting an investigation, if you will, against the wishes of his commander-in-chief? I think one of the things that we misunderstand as the general public about Robert Mueller is this was obviously an incredibly high-profile and politically charged investigation. I think in Bob Mueller's mind, it was no more than at least the third hardest thing he's ever done in his life. That he talks about one of the impacts of his time in Vietnam, that nothing he has ever done since compares to the stress of leading men in combat in Vietnam, sort of actually having men under his command die in combat. And the period after 9/11, when he was leading the FBI, this, again, incredibly important moment, incredibly stressful moment. And Mueller would say, by way of context to his staff, hey, I'm still getting more sleep than I ever did in Vietnam. That's probably how he approached being special counsel. This was an incredibly stressful role. It's not anything close to the hardest thing Bob Mueller has ever done in his life. And Garrett Graff, the very last question. Robert De Niro as Robert Mueller. What did you think? I thought he did a great job, and I think that one of the questions that I hope to get a chance to talk to Mueller about at some point when he is willing to speak is what it has been like for him to be someone who has so transformed into sort of this pop culture icon or figure. When I did my original book about him in 2010, my publisher and I debated whether we could even put his photo on the cover because he was such an anonymous figure, even then, as someone who was already then the longest serving FBI director since J. Edgar Hoover himself. And Mueller at that point was still so anonymous, we weren't actually sure that anyone would look at a book cover and have any idea who he was.
Boy, things have changed.
Absolutely.
Garrett Graff, journalist, the author of Mueller's War. It's been a real pleasure.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much. All right.